A cold wind crawled across the cemetery that morning as the billionaire Arlen grave stood frozen before the small white headstone bearing his daughter's name. The world knew him as a man of power, money, and ruthlessness, but here, among the silence and the dead, he was nothing more than a father shattered by guilt. He had tried to shield his daughter Evelyn with his wealth, to buy her happiness, to control every risk around her, but he could never control fate. Today marked 3 years since the accident, and still, the weight of regret pressed on his chest as if the earth itself was sitting on him. He came every year alone, without bodyguards or chauffeurs, and bowed his head in the icy morning, hoping for forgiveness that never arrived. If you believe in kindness, second chances, and the power of one good deed to change a life, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to the channel, and let us know in the comments where you are watching from. As Arlen stood there, breathing shakily, something unusual caught his attention, a soft, muffled sob behind him. He turned and saw a man kneeling beside a nearby grave, his uniform dusty, his face lined with exhaustion. A small boy stood beside him, clutching his father's sleeve while wiping his own tears. It took Arlen a moment to recognize the man. It was Mason Hale, the night janitor from one of Arlen's office buildings. Mason, a man who earned barely enough to survive month to month, was crying beside a grave with a level of heartbreak that made Arlen feel his own pain more sharply. Arlen tried to look away, but he couldn't. Something about the scene, this man who had so little, grieving so deeply, pulled him closer without him realizing. He walked a few steps toward them, almost unconsciously, and the details emerged. The grave belonged to Mason's wife, Lily Hale, who had passed away 2 years earlier from complications after an infection they couldn't afford to treat in time. Mason had worked double shifts trying to gather the money, but poverty moved faster than hope. Now he stood there every week, bringing his son Benjamin to talk to the mother he barely remembered. As Arlen watched, Mason slipped a tiny paper flower into the soil, handmade, imperfect, but full of love. The boy whispered something about wishing his mom could come home, and Mason closed his eyes as if fighting an ocean inside him. Arlen, who had always believed money could solve almost anything, suddenly felt painfully small beside their silent strength. He didn't speak to them that day. He didn't know how. He simply turned back to his daughter's grave, laid down a single lily, and left with a strange heaviness in his chest. But the image of Mason and his son followed him through the day like a haunting echo. It replayed as he sat in his penthouse with floor-to-ceiling views of the city. It replayed in the empty dining hall where no family laughter remained. It replayed while he stared at the untouched meal the chef had prepared. It reminded him of something he had long forgotten, the worth of love that cannot be bought, protected, or controlled, only cherished. The next week, unable to resist the pull, Arlen visited the cemetery at the same time. Mason and his son were already there. This time, Arlen lingered. He watched the way Mason encouraged Benjamin to talk to his mother, how he brushed the leaves off the stone gently, how he tried to smile even while wiping away tears when his son wasn't looking. It was a delicate balance of heartbreak and hope, the kind of courage Arlen realized he had never possessed. Arlen finally approached him with slow footsteps. Mason immediately stood up, embarrassed, apologizing for being emotional, as if grief needed permission. But Arlen shook his head softly, telling him that some pains were allowed to be seen. It was the first real conversation they had ever shared, and it felt surprisingly natural. 2 fathers, 2 graves, and 2 wounds shaped differently but bleeding the same. Over time, these cemetery encounters became a strange but comforting routine. Arlen learned that Mason had been struggling to raise Benjamin alone, juggling 2 jobs, barely sleeping, and constantly sacrificing pieces of himself to keep going. His wife Lily had been everything gentle in his life, and losing her had nearly broken him, but Benjamin's small hand in his kept him alive. Arlen found himself listening more than speaking, something he rarely did. He admired the man's resilience, his humility, and the way he managed to create small moments of happiness for his son despite carrying so much sorrow. Meanwhile, Arlen began to confront his own grief with more honesty. He spoke to Mason about Evelyn, how he had pushed her too much, how he wished he had allowed her to live freely instead of surrounding her with walls of expectations. Mason never judged him, he simply listened, offering the quiet empathy of someone who understood loss on a level no wealth could shield from. These conversations began to heal something inside Arlen, slowly, like sunlight reaching the corners of a cold, forgotten room. One evening, rain poured violently as Arlen drove past his corporate building and noticed Mason struggling to ride an old bicycle with his son seated on the back, drenched and shivering. The image struck him hard. Without hesitation, Arlen stopped and insisted they get in the car. Mason refused at first, protective of his pride, but Benjamin's chattering teeth made the decision for him. The ride changed everything. For the first time, Arlen saw their living conditions: an old, cramped apartment with broken heating, flickering lights, and hardly any furniture. Benjamin slept on a thin mattress on the floor, wrapped in a blanket patched in multiple places. Mason apologized repeatedly for the mess, but Arlen stood silently, absorbing each detail like a painful revelation. This was how the man survived, quietly, humbly, without ever asking for help. That night, something shifted inside Arlen. For years, his money had served only as a wall, a reminder of what he had failed to protect. But now, it began to feel like a tool he could finally use for something good. Not to control, not to replace, but to lift. Days later, Arlen discreetly contacted his company's HR department and arranged for Mason to be moved from janitorial duty to a stable office assistant position with better pay and working hours. He also anonymously covered Benjamin's school fees and medical insurance. When Mason found out, confusion and gratitude shook him deeply. He tried to refuse, but Arlen placed a hand on his shoulder and told him that sometimes accepting help was also an act of courage. Their bond grew, not as employer and employee, but as two men who had survived their own storms and found solace in an unlikely friendship. Benjamin began to adore Arlen, often calling him Uncle Arlen, and every time the little boy laughed, Arlen felt a strange warmth that reminded him of the sound he missed most, his daughter's laugh. Months passed, and life slowly crawled towards something brighter. Arlen invited Mason and Benjamin to his home for dinner occasionally, giving them a space where joy could exist without the weight of hardship pressing down. Mason brought sincerity and warmth to Arlen's empty mansion, and Benjamin's presence filled the air with the kind of innocence Arlen thought he would never witness again in his life. One day, Mason told Arlen he had saved enough to move to a better apartment. Arlen offered to help arrange everything, but Mason shook his head gently, saying that this time, he wanted to earn the step forward on his own. Arlen respected him even more for it. Their friendship wasn't built on charity, it was built on shared pain, trust, and gradual healing. Eventually, on the anniversary of Lily's passing, Mason invited Arlen to join them at the cemetery. Standing there, side by side beside two graves, Arlen realized how far he had come from being a man hollowed out by loss. He looked at Benjamin placing flowers on both graves and felt something inside him break open, and then breathe again. Sometimes, the families we need the most are the ones we find unexpectedly. Sometimes, lives collide in the most painful places only to light the path forward. If this story touched your heart even a little, please like the video, comment your thoughts, share it with someone who might need it today, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories. Please comment below, what part of the story moved you the most? And in that final moment, as Mason, Benjamin, and Arlen stood together in the quiet stillness of the cemetery, the breeze carried a feeling of something healing, something hopeful, proof that even in the shadows of grief, unexpected bonds can bloom into the kind of love that saves us, piece by broken piece.